You can get there from here. Physical remains of Atlantis litter the Atlantic Ocean floor, as the United States Navy knows full well. Also, you have been taught to view the ocean bottom as a contradictory way. In one respect, it's a pretty accepted view that the ocean floor spreads from a central line of volcanic uprise, pushing the continents on their merry ways. However, this perspective needs to be joined with another little idea. The Earth's crust bubbles, particularly beneath the seas, where the pressure of the water and that of the thinner crust create an energetic zone of crustal movement. Movement up and movement down. This can happen quickly, vice versa, over a longer geologic period, vide the fracturing and final sinking of the Atlantean landmass. But the essential thing to grasp here is that the solid crust of the Earth floats upward and sinks downward as the larger process of bubbling takes place in the mantle and beyond. No one knows what is really down there. Science simply guesses and passes it off as this great discovered truth. And, of course, I cannot see that far down either. It is simply too dense. First, get rid of the notion that the Atlanteans were human, or even pre-human. They were not. They were artificially created adaptations of a terrestrial hominid with a 4D consciousness. They were, in one sense, extrusions into this world. The Atlanteans were ETs far more than we are, but even those words do not begin to explain them. The Atlantean consciousness evolved from less material. Some use the term etheric, but that is just a variation on 4D form, toward the sensual or physical. The evolution of the Atlanteans was an extrusion of 4D consciousness into the 3D plane. Language pales. An et colony, if you like. However, none of this is of any great revelation. What is more important at the moment is to discuss how Atlantis fell and where it can be physically located. The Sargasso Sea is a clear indicator. The Bimini Plateau is the southern end, and the Azores are the far side. Lots of bits and pieces litter the ocean in between. The problem was that Atlantis as a continent sat on top of a mantle bubble. Over time, the Atlanteans learned how to tap the vast gases and other forces that were in a sort of geological stasis within this bubble, while succeeding cultures that remembered Atlantis lavished all kinds of moral lessons onto the use of this energy to drive technology. The actual discussion among the Atlanteans was simply whether or not this was a good idea to mess with the very foundation of the land on which they lived. Cases children of one, I removed the sexual bias, and children of Billy allow the Democrats and Republicans of that debate, which went on for ages by our calendar. The Atlanteans lived for centuries, some of them for millennia. It was natural to them. As they became more and more engrossed in the material body, however, this diminished. You can see a shadow of this in the ages given for the ancients in the Old Testament of the Bible. It was discovered, however, that the physical body could be re-energized. The process, however, was both energy-intensive, in a 4D way, which corrupted time/space as we think of it in 3D, and also corrupted the physical body if misused. Which, as Gay said, it was. Ultimately, what the old stories we have left, and the ones channeled by Case 2, are talking about when they discuss immorality is the tapping of the crustal energy to run a biomorphic technology that intensified the connection between the 4D consciousness and the 3D physical body. These technologies did not just absorb and convert the crustal contingle, they warped the natural balance between the 4D and 3D existences. This is a very organic event, in clairvoyant terms. The children of one said, "Do not do this, for the sake of living longer and gratifying your explorations of biological forms." The other side said, "Fools. You cheat yourself." Or something like that. Anyway, so it came to pass that the warpage caused the bubble to burst. Oh, sometimes language can really come across. This spewed out vast quantities of chemical compounds into the ocean, which boiled in places and caught fire. In others it just made stenchy ooze like mud. The mental bubble, once pierced, took a while to re-establish a geological balance. I think this is what Case refers to as the first and second destructions. Both times, the Atlanteans breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that's all there was. Wrong. Thank you for playing. The backwash of the final destruction, as Case calls it, was the biblical and Sumerian floods. What happened to Atlantis is that the crust subsided as the bubble beneath settled into a new equilibrium. it still leaks, and there are geomagnetic disturbances. Some of the Atlantean technology, which was solid state, is still reacting to the energy being released. This weakens the interface between 4D and 3D planes. Boiler, you got your Bermuda Triangle? You want to find Atlantis? Ask the US Navy what their acoustic imaging systems have shown. Get prepared to hear the word anomaly a lot while cruising along in their submarines. Of course, this is all fantasy to some, but to others, it is true, if you look at it. Inquiring minds want to know where they can get a piece of the rock. Are there remains of Atlantis left upon the Earth? Yes, there are. The most easily accessible ones are undersea, which is to say the least approachable ones are on land. Some of them have been, and still are being excavated by the military, formerly exclusively US forces, but now a coalition, formed largely because the US military wanted to dig in some places they couldn't swipe from the American people. Gives you a new view of certain areas of New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. But these details are digressions. The goal of finding Atlantis is not just finding some old buildings, there are plenty of those, most of them still undisturbed deep underground. The real desire is to possess their legendary technology, which is more of a general vision for most people than any actual specific object, even though they don't know what that might be. Among the accomplishments of the Atlanteans, for example, was perfect weather control. Now the average immediate notion is of abundant fields of waving grain in endless summer alongside the most beautiful of beaches. They had that, and it bored them, too utilitarian to them, like we might look at a vineyard. They left such backlands to the serving creatures. The Atlanteans had come into the physical world essentially for the stimulation. They loved storms. Whole areas of their land were given over, like national parks, to violent displays of atmospheric turbulence. Their servants, of course, were less fond of these events, which could in the equivalent of Arctic license spill over and kill them, destroy their homes, etc. If the Atlanteans 1. Noticed, and 2. Cared, they could restore all this damage at will. Some did, some didn't. They also had the ability to affect geological events for their experiential pleasure. Volcanic fountains were a favorite, but much was done with steam and mineral venting for artistic result. They had plenty of time. The earlier ones were still immortal. More than one volcanic seamount poking its head above the waters of the Atlantic Ocean started out this way. Later, of course, they lost control. Bluey, the real core of Atlantean technology that can still be dug up around the Earth, was far beyond something as simple as weather control. What has attracted the military like carrion is the threshold technology. Some hint of this just floated up in the movie Stargate, except that the Atlantean version could be called Probability Gate. It's a solid-state device, with no selectable dial like the Stargate in the movie, for instance, that uses what we think of as time/space as an energy source. The threshold is a lens into probable existence streams, or continua. The Atlanteans existed in many such streams, moving past the interdimensional barrier like salmon through rapids. This physical Earth was only one of them. There are infinitely many Earths, each with some small variation from the others, that makes it unique unto itself. The mind streams of the non-corporeal Atlanteans entered these material continua, and built outcomes like we make houses or boats. It was to them only a matter of consciousness. Sorry, but linear language will sometimes carry more than one stream at a time. But still, if any of this was true, we ought to have our share of Atlantean physical remains. We do. People ask, well, if that's true, why haven't we got any in museums? These are people who don't know how museums work. What's out on display is only what can be explained according to the reigning structure of knowledge. To do differently, of course, would make the museums look incompetent. But in reality, museum storerooms and warehouses contain vast stores of crates, drawers, and boxes whose contents have slipped from living memory. All that is left is some descriptive line in a finding aid or an index card, if that. So many index cards, so little time. A lot of Atlantean artifacts have been found, and more than a few have been thrown out in the trash by curators who either rejected them as junk, or declared them fakes or hoaxes, all because the object didn't fit into the existing intellectual recognition program running on the individual in question. Examples of this syndrome with more prosaic objects are legion. The US military got seriously interested in Atlantis in the 1940s, when some bright soul managed to connect the brilliant comments of Tesla with the little problem that had been delivered to them by the recovery of something in the New Mexican desert. Tesla explained, albeit only partly, what happened when they managed to reconstruct a strange device that was, apparently, an engine. In the 1940s, engines were used by humans for propulsion, and this thing they struggled to put back together had been smaller than the Earth. Ergo it moved, and the device that so perplexed them was what moved it. Ergo, ingenious. Not exactly. There were complications. People vanished into thin air, for example, and then returned to sight when the engine was shut off. Wow, they thought in 40s mindset, it can make things invisible. How useful. Small problem, though. The people who came back were sometimes, most of the time, not quite right. The glaring error here, naturally, is the assumption that what you saw after was what you saw before. And wrong. Thank you for playing. However, some people managed to come back better for the trip, so to speak. They told marvelous stories that didn't make any sense at all about turning up on Earth, recognizable from the moon, if nothing else, but it wasn't the Earth, really, at least not the one that we knew. Again, the concept being aired now by Fox in the show Sliders is a good representation of the effect. But, after a while, actually about 2 decades, the light bulb went on in the head of a young theoretical physicist, who really learned it from Tesla, but wasn't consciously aware of the link. What if, he said, they are traveling in time? You see, he didn't get all of it right, but the game was afoot. This fellow now runs the main administration of his endeavor. Time Tunnel was born, to use a popular metaphor of the day. They still had not figured out that moving in time/space means moving in consciousness. Remember our friends the Atlanteans? Well, it happens that some of the people who popped off on these little journeys into infinity ran into, guess who? And this really intrigued the Atlanteans no end. It was very much the planet of the apes mythos. Here the Atlanteans had self-aware versions of their own creations, known to them only as blissed-out servantoids, showing up in the equivalent of the middle of a busy street in broad daylight. This is where language gets dicey, because it is linear, and these events are not. What follows is language. Humans from the continuum of what you probably relate to as this physical Earth appeared in only *SOME* of the Atlantean continua. I know, that's hard to understand, but in time it will be clearer as you get used to 4D consciousness. The Voyagers, however, did not know this. In classical linear thought, they believed they were going to the same place. The notion of probability drift did not occur to them. Some individuals who returned to relate these things were unjustly labeled as liars, or, more usually, farmed out, literally, sent to finish off their days on remote farms, as crazies. But then some of them *WERE* crazy, because what they learned was simply not to be integrated in the mincer to which they were attached. However, eventually, slow as it was, the story was pieced together. Atlantis was not a myth. This ancient legend had a basis in fact. Furthermore, and this is really a modern development, there was more than one Atlantis. What Plato was talking about had a historical basis, but there was more than one such history. People came back with different stories, reliable, carefully picked and trained, highly motivated and dedicated types. Of course, they doubted the person, instead of looking at the pattern of the stories. In the 1960s, LSD was brought to bear on this problem. Although the use of the engines had been generally prohibited, they were again off and running when it was discovered that LSD, and now a host of more sophisticated such chemicals, broadened the insights available to what were called journeymen. They figured out the implications of their collection of devices a great deal more than they had earlier, and that started them looking around. At first, they looked under the ocean, found some stuff, but mostly the same, as if you wanted nuclear technology, and excavated Podunk, USA. You wonder how long it can take to add 2 and 2. They've got a bunch of crashed craft. They send people off into the great beyond, and maybe get the same one back. But remember, folks, we've got linear minds going full tilt here. And they are *SCIENTIFICALLY* trained minds, which means denial is in full flower. Like, Hey, could it be that portions of Atlantis still exist? Duh. And through some intense committee effort the outshoot was location of crashed saucer equals location of Atlantis. Well, close enough for government work. They stopped looking undersea and started looking on land. They could have saved themselves 10 years of trouble and countless billions of taxpayer dollars if they had simply hired a Tibetan Lama, but I digress again. There are two principal Atlantean thresholds on Earth. One is in Central Asia, appearing for all the world like a desert. The other is on the North American continent. What pisses off the US military so much is that it is largely in Mexico, with smaller areas in, as I said, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada, and appearing, for all the world, like a desert. And the Mexicans, deeply offended in the late 1940s by an aggression upon their sovereign territory, and a related anger toward the US government for not giving back the billions of Maximilian's treasury covered as part of this search process. The Mexicans don't know what the Americans want, but they can't have it, whatever it is, without paying, anyway. And since the Americans won't say what they want, the Mexicans can't fix a price, and you get the picture. So, now the US military has gone to China. Kissy. The Chinese are little more savvy in these matters, having their own collection. After all, they have their own threshold. They know exactly what they want for services rendered. Chinese. First, shove off about Tibetan and Chinese human rights violations. US. No problem. We'll have Clinton take care of it. Chinese. Okay, Charlie. Second, who we sell arms to, and what we sell, is our free enterprise business US. Okay. Sell away. Chinese, who always leave the best for last. We know how you've treated the British in these matters, who have diligently turned over everything to you, and gotten 5 cents of sweets in return. We demand full and complete presence at all operations in our territory. Further, you may take nothing with you when you leave. This was rather clever, because the Chinese knew the Americans would bring in all sorts of delicious equipment. So, even if these foreign devils were crazy, the Chinese would have good compensation for their trouble. US. Okay. Sartovos, damn, these geeks are hard to do business with. But this leaves the Americans with an unsolved problem. The Chinese don't have any operable engines of their own, and if one is taken from the States, it will have to be left there under the terms of the agreement. And you have to have one to open the door. A real poser for the US. So for now, they're just doing cartographic studies. But that committee is back in session trying to figure out a way around the difficulty.